This video will focus on pattern and how it's a part of a poem, or how patterns are built into poems. So why patterns? Well, art is generally or ultimately organization. It's the organization of visuals or organizations of words, especially in poetry. Or it's searching for order and significance. Pattern's important because you can evaluate poetry based on the coherence, the unity, and proper placement of emphasis. That's why patterns are important to look for. Every part of a poem belongs there. Every placement of words belongs where it is. So please understand when you're reading poetry that everything is on purpose, including the punctuation. So pay attention to that. The arrangement or structure of a poem's ideas, images, thoughts, and sentences may impose an external pattern, may give it an internal order, may create an external shape or form, and that contributes to the overall experience or meaning. So what are the forms of poetry then, since it's so important? Well, there are three general types of forms. The first one is the continuous form, the second, stanzaic form, and the third, fixed forms. So let's talk about continuous forms. So what is a continuous form? A continuous form is lines that follow with grouping breaks based off of units of meaning, similar to a paragraph in prose. So when you look at a continuous form of poem, there may not be any stanzas at all. It's just one big long block of poetry text. It's important then to look for where there's breaks in the poetry itself that may contribute meaning. That could be a paragraph. But since there's no paragraphs in poetry necessarily, it's not gonna be apparent. So you're gonna really have to know how it flows and where things may break. The rhyme may vary, and that might help you be able to discover where the breaks are in ideas, in meaning. But don't always depend on that. A lot of times poems won't have any rhyme. What is then the stanzaic form? Well, this part then requires you to understand stanzas. So there are stanzas that repeat, poems that repeat a certain type of stanza. So, and it usually follows a rhyme pattern or rhyme scheme. So you can pay attention to that, and that can help you. And a lot of times there's spaces between the stanzas, so you can see that as well. Okay, there may be it may be a traditional stanza pattern, maybe in one of those things, and the poet may invent an original stanza pattern. So you look at it, they're stanzas, but those aren't traditional patterns that are often repeated, or that are often used. The poet can design one themselves that looks a certain way and then repeat that stanza. Okay, in the poetry itself, Keats often does that. Traditional stanza patterns help create a kind of illusion. So it sort of, alludes to something or connects to something. So pay attention. The stanza pattern that the poet creates could be like, the shape of wings or the shape of urns or whatnot. So keep in mind. So what about it? Okay, what are some traditional stanzas that may appear as you're looking at poetry? Well, the terza, the ballad meter, the rima or rima, rhyme royal, Spenserian stanza, and ode. You could always Google to look up more about these specifically, or if you're in my class, then you can ask me and we can talk about them in particular as we look at that. Literature majors need to know them fairly well. If you're going to study literature, you need to know them so you can recognize them. General students, you should know that these things exist. So pay attention to that. Now, if you're in AP literature, like many of my students are, then in essence, you are beginning literature majors. If you're taking, you need to think about of yourself that way. So you're going to need to know them. So focus on these four things when examining stanza patterns. The rhyme scheme, if there is one. Position of the refrain, if there is one. A refrain is a stanza that's repeated or lines that are repeated verbatim. That means word for word the same. So that's a refrain. And it comes from music. When you sing songs, there are refrains that are repeated. So, if there is one, pay attention to that. looking at the stanzas. Refrains are usually indicated by a capital letter and a superscript number after the letter. This is just notation when you're writing out the refrain by rhyme. So, see the Villanelle example from the fixed form, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Pay attention to the main metrical foot. That means you have to scan the entire poem. You're going to have to mark out the meter for the entire poem. There's no short way of doing this. You're just going to have to do the entire poem. It's going to take time. Okay? When you map it out, then you will see what seems to be the foot that's generally repeated. The foot is one rhythmic unit that has one beat in it, or two beats that's repeated, or whatnot, depending on the common forms that we look at. The most common being the iamb that's repeated. That's the heartbeat. Okay, with one beat and then one soft, unaccented syllable. Dun dun. That's one foot. And when that heartbeat is repeated multiple times, then you have a line. Okay, so pay attention to the number of feet in each line, and that will help you. Okay, so make sure you practice it. There's just no easy way around it. If you want to get faster at it, you just got to do a lot. Okay, you got to commit a lot of time to be able to do that. And once you get it, it's not too difficult to remember. What is fixed poetry then? Okay, there's fixed forms that poets can then choose to write in. Okay, so fixed form poetry is, traditional patterns that apply to the whole poem. So what are they? Well, a lot of them come from the French, and in English we've practiced using a lot of the French forms, such as the rondo, the rondelle, a villanelle, the triolet, sestinas, ballades, okay, double ballades. But, the ones that really stuck for English, just two kinds. Okay, the sonnet, which comes from the Italian and then goes to Spanish, and then it starts with the Italians, and then it migrates to Spain, and from Spain to England, during the Renaissance. So that time period, this form became popular in English. And then the villanelle. These are the only two that really have concretely held on into English. So it's important for you to be aware of them. The sonnet has a bunch of different forms though, so you want to pay attention. There's really customized forms. The Romantics will customize the form, and the modern poets will play around with stanzas, and then they'll create their own types of sonnets. But the three primary sonnets that we see in English that are standard, are these types. The first, the Shakespearean, or also called the English sonnet, most popular. And then the second most popular, the Petrarchan, or the Italian sonnet. And lastly, the Spenserian sonnet. This one is a little more rare, but it does exist. We got to pay attention to how these things are constructed. So, the English or Shakespearean sonnet is the most common and basic one that you see most often. Okay, the meter is iambic pentameter, which means it's 5 heartbeats per line, and then there's 14 lines that are broken into 3 quatrains and then 1 couplet at the end. And the logic of it is usually that the problem is set up in the first quatrain, and then more about the problem is expressed in the second 2 quatrains, and then sort of the conclusion is in the couplet a lot of times, or the resolution of the problem is in the last couplet. The rhyme scheme, because English is a hard language to rhyme with compared to Spanish or Italian or French, there's lots of rhymes in here, which makes it a lot easier to handle if you're writing it. A's rhyme together, B's rhyme together. So A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So there's 5 rhymes in here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, excuse me, 8 rhymes. Not a math major. So pay attention, right? The easiest form. So do pay attention to that. Contrary to some other, writers who say that, if it's square, it's a sonnet. Yeah, sure. Sometimes it could be like that, but it's not always that way. So there's no hard and fast rule. Pay attention to these aspects: rhyme, meter, stanzas. What about the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet? Well, again, iambic pentameter, 5 heartbeats. 5 heartbeats, plus 14 lines, except this time it's organized with 1 octave. That's 1 8-line stanza, and then 1 sestet, a 6-line stanza. And the sestet, this is the fun one that a lot of people can play with. The sestet can be rhymed any way you like. Now here, the one I provided is CD, 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 CD. That appears very often. Sometimes you see CDE, CDE, or CC, DDEE. Those are, that sestet, you can play with that. But the first part, the octave, it's got to rhyme A, B, B, A, B, B, A. There's 5 rhymes in this one, so it's a lot harder to play with. 5 rhymes if you go C, D, E, C, D, E. But less rhymes mean that it's harder for you to actually manage. So keep that in mind. Okay. The Spenserian Sonnet. This one plays with rhyme a lot more, so it's a more difficult form that is less popular. Again, iambic pentameter, 5 heartbeats, and 14 lines. It's got 3 quatrains and 1 couplet, very similar to the Shakespearean one, but look at the rhyme. All right, so it goes A, B, A, B, and then B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, E, E. So you've interlaced the quatrains together. So the B becomes, that's the B rhyme that's even becomes the odd rhyme in the second stanza. And the C then, the even rhyme, becomes the odd rhyme in the third stanza. So pay attention. That makes it really more difficult because you've got to manage the different rhymes. Okay. Villanelle form now. This is the most interesting and difficult one. Poets choose this form because it is notoriously hard to compose and is a challenge of the poet's technical skill. Okay. The meter, a lot of times, is the poet's choice, but there's 19 lines. And the stanzas, there's 5 quatrains plus 1 ending quatrain. Okay. Now the difficult part comes with then the rhyme. There are only 2 rhymes to the poem as opposed to perhaps the more rhymes of the English sonnet. So the rhyme pattern looks like this: A1, B, and then A2, AB, A1, AB, A2, AB, A1, AB, A2, AB, A1, A2. Now, there's only A and B. And then if you look at the superscript 1s and 2s, those lines are exactly the same. So like A1 is then that same line that is repeated each time A1 appears. A2 is the same line that repeats each time A2 appears. The small ABs, those are all ones that rhyme with A and B, but they can be different words. The difficult thing is that those lines that are then repeated word for word have to make sense in the poem, have to make grammatical sense. And that is a definite challenge for anybody who's trying to write it. Okay, the first line is a refrain, which means it is repeated in lines 6, 12, and 18. The third line is a refrain for lines 9, 15, and 19. So you've got to repeat them word for word. So how does that look? It sounds crazy right there. It looks like a bunch of letters. So let's take a look at a sample Villanelle here. Okay, so if you take a look, the first line is repeated in all these other lines here. Okay, word for word, yet it's still got to fit in the meaning. Okay, the second rhyme, the second refrain, is then repeated in these lines here. Okay, so it's got to be word for word, and it's also got to make sense. The other lines, the smaller A's and B's, they are located here, and they can be whatever word you want, but it's got to rhyme A and B, just to give you an idea. So if you look at this poem called Villanelle, translated by John Drury, let's go ahead and read this one. My dove has flown away from me. Isn't there something I can do? I'll follow her where she may flee. You may miss your darling's company. Alas, for me the same is true. My dove has flown away from me. As your love proves its constancy, my faith will show its mettle too. I'll follow her where she may flee. Your moans recur incessantly. I swear my grief is never through. My dove has flown away from me. Now that her beauty I can't see, nothing is beautiful to view. I'll follow her where she may flee. Death so often I've made my plea. Take now what is given to you. My dove has flown away from me. I'll follow her where she may flee.